will now open the floor to the audience. I would ask you please to state your name and affiliation, and if you want to address a specific speaker, then please do so. Yes. Okay. There's a roving mic. If you'll wait for the roving mic, please.
My question is primarily, I think, to Frans, but it was raised, there's an issue that was raised later.
Yes.
And it relates to when we look at the current structure of Future Earth program. It was interesting when you showed the geographical distribution or talked about the contributors to the program, and what's clearly absent is Africa and India. And I know this is an issue that's been raised already in terms of the contribution that, in effect, the developing world is going to make to these programs. And I really see it's going to be quite difficult going forward. I mean, we may have intentions of involving these countries, these continents in the future. But, you know, if they're not there from the beginning, then I think the way we formulate programs are going to be strongly influenced by that. And you know, what I'd like to know is, you know, are there ways in which we can actually incorporate these parts of the world, the developing world in effect, as early as possible in the program?
Do you want to respond? Okay, so I agree this is a really fundamental problem. We have to accept where we are. The situation in the world today, of course, is that the most powerful science systems are in the high-income countries, particularly if you look at the existing global change programs. All of the secretariats were in Europe, in Paris, Geneva, Bonn, and Stockholm. And if you look at the science committees that run these programs, they're absolutely dominated by Europeans and Americans. So that's where we start. In Future Earth, we have a commitment that over the 10 years of the life of the program, that has to change, that there have to be southern leaders of programs and projects, and we have to create a truly global set of communities and networks. I think we start by insisting, and that's what we're doing with our own science committee, is regionally representative. So there are powerful members from Africa and Asia there. The engagement committee will be the same. In the process of creating the new permanent executive secretariat, there was an open and international call. And then ICSU and the other bodies, of course, had to work with the offers that were on the table. And unfortunately, fortunately, I mean, the offers that were on the table were from rich countries. But again, that is just where we are. We are working actively now with regional nodes in Latin America. I mean, that's been identified. There is, I had a discussion 2 weeks ago in Auckland with a consortium of African countries. So there's work going on to create a regional node there. I think there's an understanding in Africa, led by a number of countries there, that they need to come to the table and, you know, become more active and positive, proactive here, and I think that's happening. So I think we need to continue to communicate in what we do, that we are about creating over the coming period a truly global program involving scientists from all world regions. So we are putting quite a lot of effort in Africa, in young early career scientist development and so on, developing southern leaders, encouraging these countries to engage. And there's a huge appetite there, actually, and all sorts of capabilities that we need to connect up. But we can't dream these things out of thin air. It'll take time, it'll take effort, but the commitment is absolutely there and very, very, you know, strong. And in 10 years' time, we'll have a different set of communities that we can show you.
Peter, could I just...
Yes, sure.
Just for 2 minutes. One, the International Social Science Council put out a call for T4S, it was on the list up there, Transitions for Society. They insisted that every single successful call, which there were 33 successful and 700 applications, had to involve the developing world. So they're going to create a series of hubs for the developing world. Secondly, a very good colleague of mine, Mark Swilling from Stellenbosch University in South Africa, is leading a major program funded by the South African Development Corporation around urbanization in Africa and the implications of that for different forms of managing resources in relation to rapid urbanization in Africa. So these are connected into Future Earth. And I think the point that Frans and Tanja were all making is that Future Earth is evolving with a whole series of quasi-independent activities taking place all over the world, which are slowly coalescing into the whole family called Future Earth.
Perhaps I could just add on the funding side, what's very interesting within the Belmont Funding Forum, which is the group of national funders. If you look at that, of course, they have the Americans and the Germans and the Japanese and the British and so on are there. But some of the most vocal members in the Belmont Forum in relation to the Future Earth are China, South Africa, Brazil, India. Actually, India has a ministry of earth science, and wanting to become involved, wanting to also fund research which is globally connected. So I think there in the Belmont Forum you see represented changes which are happening at the global level in other fields as well.
Yes.
Yes, one brief comment from me as well. Change is happening, I think, also at the core project level, and I think that's one very important way to do this. So there are a lot of groups working on African issues, mainly funded by the European Commission or from the United States, and the core projects are now coming together. Some of them, ILIPS is involved as well, in trying to bring the current groups that are working in Africa together next year in Kenya, probably autumn 2015, to try to engage the locals as well. And I think one good way that, for instance, IGP has done this is to demand that the scientific steering committees of each core project have members from developing countries. So that can be very difficult to achieve, but many core projects have been successful with that.
Your name and affiliation, please.
Chris Addington, I'm a professional engineer, independent. The track record of leading up to Future Earth has been a number of decades. As an engineer, having moved into the corporate world and commerce in turning around 6 businesses, I've always found that within a matter of weeks of starting on a turnaround project, you can come up with meaningful, quick fixes that will transform and raise immediate hope. After some 20 years, and what we've heard today seems just to be a regurgitation of hopeful initiatives, I've yet to hear of any positive quick fixes that would infuse or to suggest that there is a way forward and that we're not just going to stagnate into another quagmire of IPCC hopefulness and, in fact, dishonesty. What quick fixes do you have? And to give you a clear idea what I mean, if you want to have a quick fix, you have to address the economic issues because societies react within economies. If you don't have stable economies or correctly structured economies, then you have a breakdown in societies. Now, the European, so I just want to very quickly put this point. The central banks are maintaining low interest rates, ridiculously low. That in itself is massively destructive. That's the kind of quick fix that is needed in real terms.
Okay, so any quick fixes in the pipeline?
You know, I mean, I hear what you say, and of course we're trying to do things quickly, and we've got some fast-track initiatives which have to do with particularly urgent issues in science and evidence. But you know, I don't think this is really about quick fixes. I think you know, changing interest rates, of course, is not in our gift either. I think what we're about is trying to understand the predicaments and dilemmas and the real challenges that come when you start talking about food security at a global level and considering the economic and the environmental and the social aspects of that, and trying to punch through to really viable and practicable routes towards sustainability over the longer term. I mean, I think what we understand in relation to the climate and ocean health and biodiversity and so on is that these are really enormous, very, very difficult, very complex, problems that are hard to understand, they're hard to keep up with. And certainly when we talk about transformations, we're probably talking about processes of change which actually take a long time to unfold. If we are talking about the transformation of energy systems towards really low carbon footprint energy systems, we may be talking about quick fixes, but actually we're talking about processes which are likely to take many decades at whatever level you're talking about, whether it's the housing stock in Dublin or whether it's to do with reinvestment in electric power systems, the development of smart networks, the electrification of mobility. These are things actually which take a long, long time to unfold. And of course, we need to inform that process of transformation. We need to be part of that. But actually, I think what we're thinking about now is there isn't a silver bullet. Many of these opportunities and options that we have themselves have all sorts of, problems associated with them. There is always going to be a toing and froing in the scientific, the technical debates, and the economic debates. Is it worth investing? There was a new report this week on the economics of the transformation towards low carbon, which is emphasizing the role of urbanization. Where are we going to put 1 billion people in the coming 30 years as they move to the cities, and seeing that as a great opportunity. But there are huge, trade-offs here. We're going to have to probably invest over the next 30, 40 years. They were arguing at least an extra 5% in the infrastructure. That's a choice we have to make now and say, well, okay, we take it. But that's a trade-off and a challenge. So I think my own sense is that we understand the complexity, the emergent qualities of these things are not necessarily into silver bullets and quick fixes. We're really trying to inform a process of dialogue with society that is really precipitating deep transformative changes which are going to be happening over a long period of time, which are very messy, which are full of conflict, which are full of uncertainty, but which we know we have to make.
Christoph, and then we take the next question.
Yeah.
Christoph.
In fact, that's one of the big challenges, and for me also a very what you addressed, because in that's also why Proclaim has such a wide set of activities targeting different groups, interest groups. I personally believe that you need to reach out, we need to reach out, not with selling our things, but convincing, but implementing that knowledge of what we as scientists worry about into the different groups. And if you can't, if your ministers are not aware and think about environmental change, about the challenges when they make their decisions, and the politicians and the people on the street and so on, if that's not implemented in their thinking, at least in their notion that they are aware about, we will not change this. And so therefore, I think in all countries, we need to reach out. We need to make this thinking about the challenge for the future and the change we need to bring in as a part of everybody's actions. And if we can't do that, we will not succeed. And we are a part of it, but a very important one, because we can, we see the few, we have the ability with scenarios to play with the future. But if you talk about dishonesty, maybe also in IPCC, to some degree, when I showed these emission pathways, maybe you address that. For me, this is, we need to talk about the business as usual and how to be less ambitious, but at least workable. Personally, I don't think that the 2-degree target is a reality in our world.
Thanks, Christoph. Next.
Thank you. Alan Jones, Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. I'd like to congratulate all the panelists and the whole programme. I think what you've built here and what you're building is a very ambitious, transformative framework. And quite frankly, it has to work, because if it doesn't, 11 years from now, the world will be in a far worse state. What I've got from your presentations is what we in science do very well, and that's the organization of science. I've heard how you're creating the platforms and the linkages within science. I've heard from Professor Ritz that he would like to see more engagement with other scientists. What I've not got a strong sense of is something that Professor Eden spoke about, which is engagement more broadly, societal engagement. And I'd like to hear a lot more on that. And in particular, I think there's one sector of society that does represent our future, and that's our children, or in some of our cases, our grandchildren. And I'd just like to take 1 minute to tell you about a small program that we run within our group in the Institute, and that is seismology in schools. And we have 55 seismometers running in Irish schools, and every time there's an earthquake around the world, something like 25,000 Irish kids are exposed to the geophysics of the Earth. And I would like to suggest that, in fact, the Future Earth consider having a very strong program of engagement at the first and second levels, as we call them in Ireland, primary and secondary school levels.
Maybe Frans.
I'm just wondering whether whoever wants to ask a question could ask a question, and then we as a panel pick and mix. Otherwise, we're not going to get everyone from the floor saying what they want, and you're running out of time.
All right.
That would work. Questions.
I'm happy to pick and mix from 5 or 6 questions, but I'd like us to hear what you have to say.
Okay, so I think you were next.
John Sweeney, Maynooth University. My question really is, how do we stop history repeating itself with IGBP? Many years ago, the late Professor Doog, who was president of the Academy here, but also president of ICSU, was responsible for the establishment of the IGBP National Committee here. And despite toiling over many decades, I think the profile of IGB never really took off. And I think the core projects tended to wash over people's heads as researchers in small countries where there are capacity issues, where there are critical mass issues. And my question is really, how do you actually get people to change research direction in Future Earth? Because that is the ultimate, I think, that we have to achieve as scientists. We know what our research needs are. Unfortunately, they're not research priorities, often at a national level. How do we make that jump and avoid falling into the trap which IGBP did, which IHDP never even got into, and which a succession of programs ever since have only scratched the surface at an international level without getting down to the level of the individual researcher?
Okay, thank you. Next question was behind you, and then this one here.
My name is Brian Ward from NUI Galway, but I'm also on the Surface Ocean Lower Atmosphere Study Scientific Steering Committee.
Right.
So one question I have for Frans is, how do you see the evolution of all these different projects that you put up in your slide in Future Earth? So for example, we're an IGBP funded project. Do you see those projects remaining in Future Earth, or will they amalgamate, will they get reduced? So that was one question. And the other question, and this is an issue that had been raised, and it's for the rest of the panel, is do they see any dilution of the hard basic science with Future Earth moving from IGBP? So those are my two questions.
Okay, thanks. A question here.
Dara Linett, Environmental Protection Agency. We'd be a funder of environmental research here in Ireland. My question is really, how do you see Future Earth liaising with, interacting with, engaging with other major funding initiatives that are going on in Europe, such as Horizon 2020. Tim Reardon talked about vision. Obviously, Horizon 2020 is a vision across a large areas, substantially funded. The JPI is a group of countries come together, setting a vision for what needs to be done and putting money behind it. And there are other initiatives there where businesses and technology are doing it on the same on the innovation field. In terms of the Irish context, the EPA has, went out and talked to about 1,800 researchers to get the vision, and that strategy has been rolled out now. I know that the Department of Jobs, Enterprise and Environment did one a few years ago, and Department of Agriculture are going. So there's a lot of vision out there. A lot of it is backed up by money currently in terms of the European Commission, JPIs by countries. EPA's strategy will be funded by the EPA. So in the context of your vision, which I would see a lot of within all of those other research areas, how do you propose that Future Earth would interact with those very well-developed mechanisms for spending money on research in priorities that the funders themselves think are the priorities?
Yeah. Okay, last chance, this area down here, this area here. No. Okay, that's all our questions for the moment. Over to the panel.
Tim, do you want to do the one about education? Because that's one that's particularly near to your heart.
Well, I'm delighted that you raised the issue of the wider issues, and particularly the next generation. There is a really growing interest among young people to be less rigid about the way they learn. And I don't think we're doing enough to capture the spirit of the social media age and the ubiquitousness of the way in which we can get knowledge. And so what we're finding, I'm finding, it's happening all over the place. If you give people an opportunity to be let loose in how they learn, and encourage the teacher, whether it's a school teacher or a university faculty member, to be a colleague in learning rather than a teacher. A very different concept. Less formal education in the classroom and the lecture theatre, much more interaction with young people, and not just young people, any people, but working in the context of these community links to get around the IGBP and the other things that we were talking about earlier. What you find is that the flexibility of learning now is so great that why we in academia are not keeping up with it. We're not really mobilizing ourselves with that in mind. So I think we should be actually holding as part of the Future Earth program networks around learning and networks around the use of media. I think those two areas are underrepresented in the Future Earth platforms, and I was looking slightly in vain from both Fran's presentation and my two colleagues next to me, with very good programs, I should say, where these things don't appear to me to be given the kind of highlighting that we should. The only other thing I was going to say is this wonderful notion of seismology around the odd earthquake in New Zealand or in Peru. I think we also need a seismology around political earthquakes and social change. And actually, I'll tell you this, if you asked a group of young people, how would you devise such a method of indicating how these things could be recorded and presented to young people? And you gave that as a challenge for 1 month, and you gave a prize to the best opportunity coming from that, you would get at least 5,000 young people engaging in that, and 4 or 5 brilliant ideas. That's my message. Give people a freedom, and they can do hundreds of things that we don't realize they could do.
So I think this is the answer to your question is we're not doing very much. We're not doing enough. I mean, we are communicating. So I mean, for instance, next week the Global Carbon Project, the Carbon Budget, that'll have a lot of media attention, and people will kind of know about it. But I think the broader societal engagement of the type you identify here sounds like a brilliant program, by the way, and it'd be great to have that globalized, that program. But I think in this case we're still looking for ideas and ways of doing that. In the initial startup, I think we we're doing what we need to do. I mean, we're 6 people in Paris, so you know, getting into these kinds of things would really take you know, much larger scale of activity. But I think this is exactly the kind of idea that we'd like to be able to. I love Tim's idea of a prize for, you know, earthquakes in politics that might have an influence on how you measure that and track it, and with social media. There are all sorts of really interesting ways of doing it. And we should engage with all of that. So, I mean, that's something that you know, we'd like ideas about. And if you know. On stopping history repeating itself, I think actually IGBP is a pretty well run and good program. It has made, you know, enormous impacts. I mean, in the whole area of ocean acidification, for instance, a lot of the IGBP's work actually has been very important, also in bringing that to the attention of international policy communities. I think your question is how can it be relevant in small countries? Actually, I think my experience with these programs is often smaller countries have more to benefit from international programs like this, because it's a way of connecting possibly small communities to global science. So actually within IGFA and the Belmont Forum, you often find that it's the Norwegians and the Danes and the Finns who are very active, and it's the French and the Germans who are perhaps, you know, for their own interests, have big systems and fund big things, have more questions about what the relevance might be. I think on changing research directions, I think that I gave you the example of the strategic research agenda that we've been heavily involved in, which is about to be launched in the coming couple of months. Agenda setting has always been a crucial role of these global programs, and often their impacts actually are invisible. So that you will have seen in Framework 6, Framework 7 calls. All sorts of calls which were not manufactured in Brussels by expert committees. Actually, they came from the science plans of IGBP programs. So this is an invisible service which is being played by these, and that's fine. I mean, you know, we don't need to be acknowledged every time. I think in this much stronger relationship to the Belmont Forum of funders as one of the parents, I think we now have a much a stronger relationship and the chance of shaping research funding. So this is also a little bit in response to the question from the representative from SOLAS. I mean, I was talking on Monday with the head of the Horizon 2020 program on environment and climate, about the European Commission funding and organising the launch of the SRA, the Strategic Research Agenda, in Brussels in the middle of November. And they're very interested in trying to use the framing that we have in organising and framing future calls, 2016, 2017, and Horizon 2020 in this area. One of the reasons why not only they, but also the big German funders and the Japanese funders are interested is because they have huge programs, but often they have been shaped by partial national interests and end up being quite fragmented and not clearly aligned to what's happening at the global level. So I think what Future Earth can provide for these kinds of large funders is a framework, a frame of reference that they can also use in the shaping of their own funding programs, and argue that they can connect their programs with programs happening in other parts of the world, thereby leveraging. So the German euro funding a program in, I don't know, sustainable consumption, then is going to be linked to a new Japanese program or a new Brazilian program in the same area, and perhaps you can find ways of connecting that. Now, the only way that can happen is through a structure like Future Earth, and we're really trying to do that more mechanistically, perhaps. The Belmont Forum, as you know, has these calls called collaborative research actions. We are part of that process. Future Earth is part of the ideas factory for new CRAs. So, for instance, I'm going to Beijing in 3 weeks' time to pitch 4 ideas coming from our SRA to the Belmont Forum funders on tipping points and thresholds in those systems, on urban pathways, on sustainable consumption, and on the nexus between energy, water, and energy, arguing that they should be launching global research programs in this area. And I expect that at least some of those areas, some of those ideas will lead to new funding programs at the international level. So I think there's more this tighter articulation between the research community and the funders in this way, driven, of course, by societal challenges and all of that, I think will mean that we can actually begin in some way to reshape funding agendas and therefore science agendas, because, of course, science goes where the money is. So we hope that we are part of that. And I think that is partly also the response to the Horizon 2020 JPI question from EPA. I think I think I've tried to describe some of the mechanics of those relationships. They're very close. I mean, we talk to, the people who are running the NSF programs, the NERC programs, the NRF programs in South Africa, and so on. These are daily contacts. So that machine is in place now. Yeah.
Tanja?
Yes, a couple of comments on a few questions that have been made. So firstly, about what is required for change. So in the Finnish National Committee with our stakeholders, we've been discussing this. And one thing that is absolutely crucial, of course, is to get the private sector in. Without that, nothing will really happen. And one of our stakeholders came up with an idea to have guidance measures from the government, carrots and sticks. And one good way would be to look at the very strict process of getting a permit for new operations, for instance, in mining industry and related industries. So one good idea could be to ease that process for companies that are good, that, for instance, take preliminary measures to compensate for the environmental damage that they are about to do, and then make the process really difficult for those companies that are bad. So that would be an incentive. There needs to be a financial or a practical incentive for companies. So we are going forward with that idea. And then about what happens to the core projects in Future Earth. Well, I still represent one of the core projects called ILIPS. It works on the land-atmosphere interactions. And what we did, we included a social science aspect. We invited social scientists and socioeconomists in our scientific steering committee. We revised our strategic plan to include integrated social science, natural science research themes, and we came up with a number of new initiatives that have this integrative idea and also a strong co-design element. And finally, about what to do with these existing funding agencies, that's exactly what the European Alliance is trying to do on a European scale. We see no reason why the Commission or the JPIs wouldn't be interested in getting a more adequate representation of European science and stakeholder needs and priorities. So that's what we are trying to offer them. And in our upcoming annual meeting, we will discuss the best ways to do this. So what we need to find are the best interfaces to, let's say, JPIs or the Commission Horizon 2020. And whether it be the working groups or the boards of different JPIs, they all work a little differently. We need to find the right people, the right interfaces to connect with. And then I think we're on to business, at least I hope so. Thank you.
Just a couple of, again, this question about GEC projects. The existing projects have all been invited to join Future Earth. And that process is ongoing. There's a procedure for that. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that they will ad infinitum continue in their current forms. I mean, we encourage people, of course, in the framework of Future Earth, as Tanja also says, to kind of begin rethinking about who they are, the kinds of linkages they may want to make with other programs and projects, and how they work, how they do science and so on. So that's certainly part of something that we'd like to refresh, these projects. Not that they are doing great work, but we need to move on. On the question, this question about basic or hard science and dilution within Future Earth, I mean, I think that's absolutely not what we're about. I mean, a fundamental understanding, good data, models that are effective and work. These are fundamental to our claim to say anything in science. And if we lose that, then we are nowhere. I think the challenge, though, is to take the next step, of course, is to see the societal challenges around food security, water security, climate stabilization, and so on, as the context within which we need to frame new kinds of more integrated questions leading to new breakthroughs in fundamental science that in the long run will have an impact. So for me and for us, I think we don't at all see any contradiction between responding to real questions and doing fundamental science. I mean, of course, many of the greatest breakthroughs in science have been made as a result of a response to a question of disease transmission, or understanding earthquakes. I mean, that has led to huge improvements in our understanding of the solid Earth. So, or exoplanets, or whatever you're talking about. So, we see this relationship between societal questions in society, and fundamental science as being creative. And one that doesn't exclude the other. So that's our starting point, I think.
Okay, Christoph, just 1 minute. Then
Yep. Very quick on research question, direction change. I believe one of the key thing is election of new faculty members. How do you do that? How is that process? Because that's then again 20 years or 30 years of a person doing it. So if you do it right, then you have a big influence on the research of the future. And also the question on funding. Future Earth doesn't fund research by itself. So the scientists need to go out to find the right funding for their research. So it's hopefully the funders, they see their area is open enough, and so they can as well satisfy the global change, future Earth targets and visions and science plans and the ideas of the funder. So I think it can be both ways. It doesn't need to fit exactly the science plan of future Earth. It just need to be open that scientists can join and be active in future Earth.
Okay, so thanks for that. Let us thank our speakers again: Frans Berkhout, Tanja Suni, Tim O'Riordan, and Christoph Ritz.